Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is William Henry Harrison, Part 2. We stopped last time in 1811. We talked about the Battle of Tippecanoe, Indiana, in which Harrison got his nickname, Tippecanoe, or they used to call him Old Tip. And then during the 1840 presidential election, Tippecanoe and Tyler, too. So the Battle of Tippecanoe, Indiana, in which Tecumseh's forces had been defeated by the U.S. military, led by General Billy Harrison. And, of course, Tecumseh had been trying to unite American Indian nations to stop Western expansion. The country was headed for war with Great Britain, and American Indians, which war broke out, the War of 1812. The following year, and General Harrison was a general in the war. He was given command of the Northwest frontier. He was very popular nationally because of his victory at Tippecanoe. Henry Clay was a supporter. Clay said this about Harrison, quote, "No military man in the U.S. combines more general confidence in the West. I hope the President will find it proper to bestow on him one of the brigadier's appointments lately authorized." So as a commander, as a military leader, Harrison was informal, a simple, easy man to like, and he was not a bully. One soldier said this about Harrison, that he was someone, quote, "in whose company we cannot but be perfectly at ease." He had these Kentucky volunteers eager to fight and hard to discipline. William Hull had been appointed the top general in the West, not Harrison, and that appointment was very unfortunate. Hull was not a good leader, and he surrendered Detroit to the British, the Indians, and Tecumseh without a fight. It was very bad news for the country. Indiana was in a state of panic and siege after that, lots of fear. The Indians were on the offensive. In September of 1812, Harrison and the U.S. Army were marching north to face the issues, the problems. In August of 1812, Tecumseh and the Indian forces defeated General Thomas Van Horn in the U.S. Army near Detroit. Tecumseh was commissioned as a brigadier general in the British Army. And again, this was really terrible when General Hull surrendered Detroit without a fight. Without fighting, he was so scared of fighting Indians, especially. So the Indians smelled victory. They were pretty excited this time. Tecumseh was excited. William Henry Harrison, was appointed a brevet major general leading the Kentucky militia, and they were planning to attack Detroit. And later, he was got a commission as brigadier general in the U.S. Army. James Winchester was in command of the U.S. Army in New York. The winter of 1812-1813 was hard times. Food was scarce for the U.S. Army. The men were cold and hungry, and there were lots of desertions. In January of 1813, General James Winchester, leading the U.S. Army, he was at the Sandusky River, and he was sent to rescue folks in Frenchtown on the Raisin River in Michigan, which was under British control. And he was defeated. The army was defeated by the British and the Wyandot Indians, led by Chief Roundhead. So the U.S. Army surrendered there. And after surrendering, the prisoners were massacred. This, very unfortunate, tragic. This led to a battle cry, "Remember the Raisin." Remember the Raisin. Henry Clay's brother-in-law was killed and scalped at that time. There were Indian attacks on Fort Harrison, which was in Fort Wayne, Indiana, in September. May of 1813, General Harrison was at Fort Meigs in northwest Ohio. The British and Indians attacked. The British had artillery fire. Americans were in trenches for protection. And the British failed to take Fort Meigs, M-E-I-G-S. The British General Proctor had promised to deliver Harrison into the hands of Tecumseh if captured. The Indians wanted to torture and burn Harrison. I don't believe Tecumseh would have allowed that. But at any rate, he was not captured. Proctor wanted the Indians to do the fighting. Okay, then later the British attacked Fort Stephenson near Sandusky, Ohio. They failed in that. This was another American victory. And Tecumseh was becoming discouraged, and a number of his Indian forces were leaving and going home. May of 1813, again back to the British siege of Fort Meigs, northwest Ohio. General Harrison spoke to his troops there, quote, "Can the citizens of a free country think of submitting to an army composed of mercenary soldiers, reluctant Canadians, goaded to the field by the bayonet, and of wretched, naked savages? Can the breast of an American soldier, when he casts his eye to the opposite shore, Fallen Timber's battle site, the scene of his country's triumphs over the same foe, be influenced by any other feelings than hope of glory?" September of 1813, Beaver, Harrison's one-time adopted Indian son, he learned that an Delaware Indian, or an Indian named Blue Jacket, planned to assassinate Harrison, and Beaver killed him to protect his second father. Oliver Hazard Perry led the U.S. Navy to defeat the British Navy in western Lake Erie near Put-in Bay, and the British abandoned Fort Malden in Ontario near Detroit. At this time, the fight was going into Canada. British General Proctor retreated up the Thames River. Yeah, that was a big deal, the Oliver Perry's victory against the British. Now, one of the major battles of the war, and then certainly in the life of William Henry Harrison, was the Battle of the Thames River in Ontario, Canada. Harrison led 3,500 American troops. The British only had 800, and the Indians 500, the British and Indians together. Richard Johnson was a Kentucky colonel in the American forces. In this battle, Tecumseh was killed, and this ended his Indian Confederacy because he was such an important, charismatic leader. This was the end of his dream of uniting American Indians to stop American expansion. There was euphoria in the United States because of great joy over the death of Tecumseh, because he was such a threat to American possibilities. In New York City Hall, there was a picture of William Henry Harrison, honoring him for his efforts. He was a major hero in the war, second only to Andrew Jackson. The battle took place, Thames River, October 5th, 1813. And in which Tecumseh died. Backing up a little bit, in October, Harrison and the U.S. Army, he had 3,500 Kentucky troops, and they arrived at abandoned Fort Malden. He was pursuing the British in Ontario and the Indians and Tecumseh. Tecumseh believed, he had a sense that he was going to die and that his cause was lost. At the battle at the Thames River, the British surrendered quickly. However, the Indians fought on, and a number of Indians died, and then the rest disappeared. At the end, there were 300 Indians. Well, in the battle, 300 Indians were killed, including Tecumseh. The Shawnee Indians believed that Tecumseh would come again to unite the Indians. They had that hope. His brother, Tenskwatawa, lived until 1834, died on a Kansas Indian reservation, despised by his own people. Now, in the battle was a frontiersman named Simon Kenton, who had a lot of respect for Tecumseh, and he knew that the soldiers, they were looking for Tecumseh's body so they could hack off souvenirs, which was a terrible thing. Hack off, his fingers and so forth. Horrible. Anyway, Simon Kenton, folks knew that he knew who Tecumseh looked like, so he purposely misidentified Tecumseh's body so it would not be desecrated. So that was a nice thing that Simon Kenton did. Later, Indians retrieved Tecumseh's body and buried him. Tecumseh, the great Shawnee Indian, was the epitome of the noble opponent, and his memory lives on. There is a Tecumseh the Show, which is a drama performed in Chillicothe, Ohio, based on a play written by Alan W. Eckert, who wrote a tremendous biography of Tecumseh. And the Tecumseh, the play, is performed every summer in Chillicothe, Ohio. Since 1973, 2.5 million people have watched this show performed in the outdoor Sugarleaf Mountain Amphitheater. Very interesting. Now, another reason Tecumseh is remembered so well and respected so much, he was the only Indian leader who forbid the torture of prisoners, which was a common practice of other Indian leaders. So the death of Tecumseh was a major achievement of General Harrison, his defeat at the Thames River. In 1814, Richard Campellaire wrote, quote, General Harrison is at Washington, reaping the rewards of his patriotic zeal and military achievements. His character is now the object of general attention, and the point on which consolation seems to rest. His cautious and cool, deliberate valor inspire universal confidence. Now, politics is always an issue. Secretary of War John Armstrong did not like William Henry Harrison, and that led to conflict. In May of 1814, Harrison resigned from the Army, and this was the end of his military career for the second time. He returned to Cincinnati, his home, in the Cincinnati area, and was involved in road building and canal building for better transportation, which was very good for farmers, helping them get crops to market. Ohio was booming. Ohio was growing. Lots of population was rising. People were moving in. A lot of development happening. Harrison said this at 1814, quote, I am settled here, I believe, for life, with as good a prospect of happiness as any person could have. He was 49 years old. He had 9 children plus 2 adopted children, and he was involved in farming. He wrote a lot of letters for soldiers, veterans, trying to help them with money, get medical care, and jobs. He was a champion for veterans. This was his lifelong passion, working to help veterans. In his home in the Cincinnati area, he expanded it to a 16-room clapboard house. In one bedroom closet, it was kept in the log fashion. You could still see the logs on the wall for nostalgic purposes. He had a big family, was very hospitable. It was written, quote, he kept an open table to which every visitor was welcome. A congregational minister who visited said, quote, the table was loaded with abundance and with substantial good cheer, especially with different kinds of game. It was reported that his family and guests would consume 1 entire ham per day. Another visitor, a minister, had this to say about William Henry Harrison, quote, he is a small and rather sallow-looking man who does not exactly meet the associations that connect themselves with the name of a general. There was something imposing in the dignified simplicity of his manners. Harrison was the most prominent citizen in southern Ohio. He would dedicate new buildings, gave speeches, and attended endless dinners. He was famous. By 1817, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from Ohio, served 2 years, promoted pensions for widows and orphans of American soldiers killed in the War of 1812. He also believed in universal military service and had this to say, quote, the whole secret of ancient military glory, the foundation of that wonderful combination of military skill and exalted valor, which enabled the petty republic of Athens to resist the mighty torrent of Persian invasion, which formed the walls of Sparta and conquered the Roman legions to the conquest of the world, will be found in the military education of the youth. You can see his intellectual bent. He was very knowledgeable regarding ancient Greece and Roman ancient history. 1819, he did not run for re-election, returned to his home in Ohio. He was elected to the Ohio State Senate and proposed a bill for public schools. That same year, 1819, he had a son, James, that died at age 1, just a baby. Tragic. From 1819 to 1825, Harrison served in the Ohio State Senate. And then by 1825, he was elected to the U.S. Senate from Ohio. He supported President John Quincy Adams. He also promoted federal spending for infrastructure, especially roads. Harrison said, quote, I have seen a great deal of human misery, but I have never seen it in any shape which touched my heart in greater degree than in the emigrants to the western country before the Cumberland Road was constructed. 1826, his daughter Lucy died at age 26, the mother of 4. More tragedy in his personal life. 1828, his son William Jr. Was struggling, and he wrote a letter to his son, and he said, quote, I must again exhort you to abandon the lounging and procrastinating mode of life, which for some time you have followed. In the morning, go to your office and stay there until dinner. And if you have no other business, read professional books, and never open any other book in those hours devoted to business. By 1828, Harrison became the first U.S. ambassador to Colombia in South America, which was newly independent. During his time, he offended the Colombian president Simón Bolívar, who was actually the liberator of northern South America against the Spanish. And he urged Bolívar not to become a dictator and was recalled. I don't think Harrison understood that Spain had not had a democratic culture. In the Latin American countries, it was very tough for them to be democratic, and generally seemed to be natural for them to have dictators because of their history, unlike that of the United States, which had learned democracy from Great Britain. Backing up a little bit, 1828, he was in financial trouble, which, ongoing financial problems due to all these kids he had, and especially when his kids would die, he had grandchildren to raise. He was hoping to become U.S. ambassador to Colombia, and he got that job. And Simón Bolívar was, like I said, famous person in history, was the president at that time. Colombia included Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador, so it was a much bigger country called Gran Colombia. So his son Carter came with him as his attaché, helping him. It was a long trip by sea and then on land through the Andes Mountains. The mail took 6 months to get there. Harrison was very gregarious. He made friends easily. He had a garden in Colombia, I believe in Bogota, and it was written, quote, "When a dinner is given by any of the diplomatic corps, he is always called upon for his vegetables." However, he was recalled by President Jackson, and they didn't seem to get along. Well, they were in opposite parties. William Barry protested his recall, and he said, quote, "If you had seen him as I did at the Battle of the Thames, you would, I think, let him alone." Now, during Harrison's time in Colombia, Simón Bolívar was indeed becoming dictatorial, which was the tendency in Latin American countries, again, based on their history and their culture. And Harrison wrote a letter to Bolívar, and he said, quote, "Are you willing that your name should descend to posterity amongst the mass of those whose fame has been derived from shedding blood, without a single advantage to the human race?" Now, Bolívar believed that Harrison was plotting with rebels against the government, so he wanted him to leave. His tough trip home to the U.S., Harrison was stuck in Cartagena, Colombia, for several weeks. New York businessman Silas Burroughs gave Harrison a ship to return home. He had been gone for 19 months. He brought home with him a pet macaw bird. He had also learned Spanish, but his financial problems continued. He had an iron foundry business which failed. 1831, he ran for the U.S. Senate but lost. The previous year, 1830, his son John died of cholera, father of 6, at age 32. And this increased Harrison's burdens. He had to support the widow and 6 children. He called the death of his son John, quote, "the most severe affliction I have ever experienced." So much tragedy in his personal life. His son, that in 1831, his son William had a drinking problem, and Harrison became a prohibitionist. He hoped that the prohibitionists wanted to make alcohol illegal. He only served sweet cider. He stopped serving hard cider in his home. He stopped serving alcoholic beverages. By 1835, people were looking at the 1836 U.S. presidential election, and there was talk that Harrison was a candidate. And Harrison said this in 1835, quote, "Some folks are silly enough to have formed a plan to make a president of the United States out of this clerk and clodhopper." Now, the other potential candidates in the Whig Party were Daniel Webster and Henry Clay. 1836, Harrison was a clerk of the county courts in Cincinnati. He was having financial and health trouble, although still he was always cheerful, living in Cincinnati. Cincinnati area. A French traveler named Michel Chevalier wrote this about William Henry Harrison in 1836, quote, "I met with one incident in Cincinnati, which I shall long remember. I had observed at the hotel table a man of about medium height, stout and muscular, and of about the age of 60 years, yet with the active step and lively air of youth. I had been struck with his open and cheerful expression, the amenity of his manners, and a certain air of command which appeared through his plain dress. That, said my friend, is General Harrison, clerk of the Cincinnati Court of Common Pleas. He is now poor, with a numerous family, neglected by the federal government, although yet vigorous because he has the independence to think for himself." So the 1836 U.S. presidential campaign, Harrison biographer Freeman Cleaves wrote this about the 36 campaign trip from New York City to Ohio. Quote, "Old soldiers with tears in their eyes crowded forward. In powerful, well-sustained tones, William Henry Harrison would roll off sonorous phrases, bringing back to a plain people memories of hard-won glories in historic councils. And on the battlefield, there was such a thing as public nostalgia in an era of bewildering change. The appearance of the gray-haired farmer and general served as a reminder of heroic and difficult years." There were, again, several Whig candidates for president, and they hoped, supposedly, by having, there were three, they hoped to divide the vote and have it sent to the House, in which one of them could win. One interesting thing, during the campaign, there was a 3,275-pound ox barbecued in Columbus, Ohio, the public square during the as a campaign event. Harrison was nominated by the Whigs, and again, there were three nominees. There was a rumor that Harrison was, quote, "an old, broken-down, feeble man." In the election, William Henry Harrison, 1836, he won the states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Vermont, New Jersey, Indiana, and Ohio. He received 73 electoral votes, but Martin Van Buren, the Democratic nominee, received enough votes to win, so it did not go to the House. So Martin Van Buren was the new president, elected in 1836. By 1838, his son William Jr. died at age 35 of alcoholism. More tragedy. The following year, his son Carter died at age 27. Tragic. By 1839, folks were looking toward 1840, another presidential election, and the Whigs held their nominating convention in December of 1839 in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. There were many newspaper reporters. At that time, there were many newspapers in the United States, beginning of the communications revolution, and folks could subscribe by mail to a possible 300 different newspapers at that time. Harrison got the nomination of the Whig Party on the third ballot, and he beat out Henry Clay and General Winfield Scott, so he was the nominee heading into the 1840 presidential election, and his vice presidential nominee was John Tyler from Virginia. Anthony Norton, a Whig newspaperman, regarding the Ohio Whigs State Convention, wrote, quote, "It was an army with banners moving through the streets, whose walls were hung with flags, streamers, and decorations in honor of a brave old patriot and pioneer, who had given the best strength and years of his life to protecting the poor men and women and children in the frontiers, and who had settled down in a log cabin to spend his days as a humble farmer in North Bend, Ohio." Interesting story. House of Representatives Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania was a champion of Harrison. He was against the Freemasons, which became a political force, anti-Freemasons, which he called a prostituted order that drank wine out of human skulls. Now, Stevens' enemies said that he had committed blasphemy by giving communion to a dog. Oh, gosh. Harrison was... Again, he had been competing with Henry Clay for the Whig nomination, and Harrison wrote a letter to Clay and said, quote, "A few years ago, I could not have believed in the possibility of my being placed in a position of apparent rivalry with you, particularly in relation to the presidency, an office which I never dreamed of attaining, and which I had ardently desired to see you occupy. I confess I did covet the second, but never the first office in the gift of my fellow citizens. Fate, as Napoleon Bonaparte would say, has placed me where I am, and I await the result which time will determine with as little anxiety as anyone ever felt so situated. Now, in the campaign, there was a newspaper supporting the Democrats and Martin Van Buren, and had this to say about Harrison, quote, Give him a barrel of hard cider and settle a pension of $2,000 a year on him, and my word for it, he will sit the remainder of his days in a log cabin by the side of a sea coal fire and study moral philosophy. So the Whigs took up that quote. Really had a big effect in the 1840 campaign for Harrison. Tippecanoe and Tyler too. They had the Hard Cider Press newspapers for Harrison, Old Tip's Broom newspaper. There were lots of different things produced for the campaign. Log cabin handkerchiefs, log cabin sunbonnets, log cabin buttons, log cabin teacups, log cabin plates, log cabin glee clubs, singing, log cabin songbooks, Tippecanoe tobacco, Tippecanoe shaving soap. And a Whig editor wrote, quote, Little did the simpleton who proposed pensioning the hero of the Thames with a log cabin and hard cider dream that his taunt would raise such a tornado. So the Whigs really went with this log cabin hard cider theme for the 1840 election. One campaign story was that there was a so-called log cabin chap who knocked on the door of the White House at 8 o'clock a.m. and wanted to see President Martin Van Buren, and was told by a, quote, fat servant that he was too early and should return at 10 a.m. And he responded and said, quote, I'll come here the 5th of March, and at daylight, and I'll see the President. Old Tip is a mighty early riser. I never heard of his being catched napping. There were plenty of songs in the campaign. It was reported that General Harrison was sung into the presidency. It was an amazing campaign. Abraham Lincoln, who was a member of the Whig Party, endorsed Harrison and said, quote, So long as human nature remains as it is, so long as men continue ambitious of distinction, it is not the part of wisdom in any community to let that ambition go ungratified in an individual who has rendered arduous and valuable services. During the campaign, Harrison's son Benjamin, who was a doctor, died at age 33. 6 of his children had died at this point, so he was really hurting. Really, all this there had been so much tragedy in his personal life. During the campaign, he made stops all over Ohio, in Dayton, Columbus, Delaware, and Sandusky, before giving a speech at Fort Meigs. There were log cabin rallies in Cleveland and in Columbus. The Buckeye tree also became a Whig emblem, which is the state tree for Ohio. One of the campaign songs went like this, quote, What has caused this great commotion motion our country through? It is the ball a-rollin' on, for Tippecanoe and Tyler too, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, and with them we'll beat little Van. Van is a used-up man. Another jingle for the Harrison campaign went like this, quote, Let Van his coolers of silver drink wine, and lounge on his cushioned settee. Our man on a Buckeye bench can recline, content with hard cider is he. Another jingle was, Farewell, dear Van, you're not our man. To guide our ship, we'll try Old Tip. Now the Van Buren and the Democrats came up with their own jingle that went like this, quote, Hush, hush-a-bye, baby, daddy's a Whig. Before he comes home, hard cider he'll swig. Then he'll be tipsy and over he'll fall. Down will come Daddy, Tip, Tyler, and all. Another this was the most entertaining campaign, I think, in American history. Certainly for that era, when life was pretty simple and people were working a lot and there was no television or movies. The only entertainment you could sing yourself or play a musical instrument. They had traveling. There was traveling circuses, the gypsies, and sometimes traveling acting groups. So this was really a lot of fun. This really a fun campaign that people enjoyed very, very much. Well, that concludes today's presentation. Tomorrow we'll continue with part 3 of the life of William Henry Harrison. You might consider checking out our website, Adventures in History, with Peter J. Ray at peterjray.com. So far, we have made 574 history videos in 7 areas: world history, American history, book reviews, poetic tours, Cleveland baseball, family history, and autobiography. You also might consider checking out our podcast, which you can listen to, Adventures in History, which you can listen to on Spotify, Breaker, Google Podcasts, and Radio Public. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.